The time of the judges in Israel was a tumultuous time in their history. After the time of great victory that was experienced during the days of Joshua, their disobedience led them to turning to other gods and angering Jehovah God, which then led to God punishing them. And then, whenever they would repent and cry out to God for deliverance, God would raise up a judge for them who would conquer their enemies. And this cycle just kept happening, as we have seen already as we were looking in the book of Judges itself. But now we continue to observe some events that happened during this period, and then we see the transition to the next period as well as we keep on into this week's lesson. Let's begin by thinking about the story of Ruth and Boaz. The book of Ruth introduces itself as recording events that transpired during the time of the judges. Ruth chapter 1 and in verse 1. It says, during the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Now, it's not exactly sure when these events took place during the time of the judges. And it's not really a book that's showing us the same pattern of sin and judgment and deliverance that the book of Judges was. But certainly it is a story that, as we'll see at the end of the book, that has historical significance to the Bible story, as well as just some many points that we could look at concerning the story itself, of things we can learn from. But what we find as we start looking into its story is that at this time, during the time of the judges, there was, of course, a famine that had hit the land, and an Israelite man named Elimelech left Bethlehem to go to the territory of Moab when this famine hit, along with his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, in verses 1 and 2. And what we find is that sometime after this, that Elimelech died. Verse 3 shows us that. And this woman, Naomi, was left with her two sons. Well, we also see that these sons each took wives from Moabite women there in verse 4. One of the sons, Chilion, married a woman named Orpah, and Ruth married Mahlon in verse 4, but you can also go over to chapter 4 and verse 10 and find out who Ruth's husband was. We see, though, that after these two women married these two sons of Naomi, that both of these men died in verse 5. And the woman was left without her two children and without her husband. And so we see that all of these women now have lost their husbands, and they're left childless as well. After the death of her husband and sons, we see that Naomi then set out to return to her home, and she gave her daughters-in-law her blessing to stay in their homeland. Remember, they're women from Moab, and remarry there. Let's look in verses 6 through 13. She, that's Naomi, and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband." She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, "We insist on returning with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters. My life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And so we can see that they have this opportunity, just go back to their people to remarry and to continue on with their lives. That, according to uh, the way things were at that particular time, that if a woman's husband died and she was left childless, she was to marry. Then it was the responsibility of her husband's brother to raise up offspring uh, for her to keep that lineage alive, and so forth. And Naomi's trying to help them understand that no, this isn't going to happen, and I'm not going to have any more children, and that even if I did, are you going to wait that long for that to happen? Well, Orpah listened and went back, but Ruth clung closely to Naomi, verses 14 through 17. Again, they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother in law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister in law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister in law." But Ruth replied, "Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me." So Ruth's going back with Naomi. And when they returned, what we find is that Ruth proved to be a very diligent worker to provide for herself and Naomi by gathering what was left in the grain fields of a man that belonged to Boaz, a man named Boaz, who was a relative of Elimelech. That's chapter 2 and verses 1 through 3. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabitess asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor?" Naomi answered her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. And Boaz took notice of her and had learned of her kindness and sacrifice for Naomi. In verses 11 and 12, Boaz answered her, that is Ruth, "Everything you have done for your mother in law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Ruth is being rewarded now for her diligence toward Naomi, and Boaz is also helping to take care of her. And he made special provisions for Ruth. And Ruth continued working in verses 13 through 23 of this chapter. Later, Naomi told Ruth to approach Boaz in a very specific way, and it may somewhat seem odd to us, but it was done in a way that would essentially express her desire to be redeemed by Boaz. Again, remember, it was the responsibility of brothers to continue the family name for a childless widow. Yet Ruth's husband had no remaining brothers. You can go and read some of the law concerning that in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. Whenever one kinsman who was closer in connection to uh, to Elimelech and to therefore Ruth um, refused to redeem Ruth and property from Naomi, there was going to be certain amounts of costs to him. Boaz then agreed to marry Ruth in chapter 4, verses 9 through 10, continuing with the customs and such of the day. Ruth 4, verses 9 and 10, Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are all witnesses today." And so the people then at the city gate prayed a blessing for Ruth in verses 11 and 12. It says, "All the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, 'We are witnesses today. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and your name well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" And indeed, we see that Ruth conceived and gave birth to a son named Obed in verses 13 through 17. It tells us, "Ruth took Boaz, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him.' Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. The neighbor woman said, 'A son has been born to Naomi,' and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." And so, therefore, we see that this story is historically significant, as this is the family line that the Bible is going to continue to trace. As we've already seen, something special is going to happen through Judah. And now we're getting this family line that we're seeing now that talks about Obed and Jesse and David. And this is significant concerning the seed promise that we are continuing to take note of and be watching for throughout the Bible story. Verses 18 through 22 gives us some of the records from Perez down through Boaz and Obed, Jesse, and David. But next, as we come back to more of the direct line of the story, continuing in the period of the judges, we pick up with other judges. In fact, we find some things concerning Eli and Samuel. Eli, who was a priest, was the next in the line of Israel's judges. And during this time, a man named Elkanah, who had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah, went every year to worship and sacrifice to God at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located at the time. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. We see that Hannah was childless, and both of these women come up with Elkanah every year. And we see Eli and his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were also the Lord's priests. Hannah was deeply hurt due to being childless and was taunted by her husband's other wife, who did have children. And we can see how Elkanah, he gave a double portion to Hannah in verse 5. And he loved her even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. But yet her rival, this other wife, would taunt her severely just to provoke her because the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. And so year after year, this would go on. And then what we find is that on one occasion, Hannah prayed to the Lord at the tabernacle, vowing that she would give her son to the Lord if he would bless her with a son. Starting in verse 9. On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. The priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and do not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. Later, what we find is that God did bless her with a son, who she named Hannah, Hannah named Samuel. There in verse 20, that Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, because she said, I requested him from the Lord. Now, when this son grew to the point of not needing her, being weaned in that sense, she took him to Eli and left him in Eli's care to fulfill her vow just as she had said. Verses 23 through 28. And what we find is that here's this boy, as she tells Eli, bringing this bull for sacrifice, and here is this son presented to Eli, starting in verse 26, Please, my Lord, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord gave me what I asked him for, I now give the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Then he worshiped the Lord there. So now Samuel is left in Eli's care. Now, Eli's sons were very wicked men, and God was angry with them, and God intended to kill them. You can see different indications about that as you read through chapter 2, for example, in verse 12, or in verses 22 through 25. We can also notice this. Now, Eli was very old. He heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they were sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He said to them, Why are you doing all these things? I have heard about your evil actions from all these people. No, my sons, the news I hear the Lord's people spreading is not good. If one person sins against another, God can intercede for him. But if a person sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to their father, since the Lord intended to kill them. You can also go on and read 27 through 36. But in contrast with Eli's own sons, we see that Samuel in verse 26, that he grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Now, one day then, as time went on, we see that God called to Samuel and revealed the devastation that was going to happen to Eli and his family. You read about that in chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. But what we also see then happening is that as time went on here, we see that Samuel grew, verses 19 through 21. The Lord was with him, and he fulfilled everything Samuel prophesied. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a confirmed prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear in Shiloh because there he revealed himself to Samuel by his word. Now, as this story goes on, what we find then is some things concerning Israel and the Philistines. Now, perhaps the evil deeds that were present in Eli's sons, who were priests, indicate the very wickedness that was present in Israel during this time. And so, as Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle, what we find is that they were actually defeated there in chapter 4 and the first 2 verses. As the Philistines lined up in battle formation against Israel, and as the battle intensified, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who struck down about 4,000 men on the battlefield. And then what we find happening is they tried again, and they were defeated even more. In fact, to the tune of 30,000 soldiers, including Eli's sons. And what we find is that they had taken the Ark of the Covenant as well to the battle, and the Ark of God was also captured. Now, presumably, it was captured as they seemed to have been trying to force God to help them, rather than repenting and crying out to him. Because we know, of course, that when God is with his people and the people are pleasing to him, that God delivers great victories no matter who the enemy is. But that's not what happened here, implying their wickedness that was going on. Certainly, we know that to be the case with Eli's sons. In verses 10 and 11, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and each man fled to his tent. The slaughter was severe. 30,000 of the Israelite foot soldiers fell. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Now, all of this then gets reported to Eli, and he died. In verse 18, when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off the chair by the city gate, and since he was old and heavy, he broke his neck and died. Eli had judged Israel 40 years. So Israel's been defeated. Eli has died. His sons have died, and the ark of God has been taken by the Philistines. But the Philistines experienced great consequences for possessing the ark of God. And this included that the idol of their god Dagon being broken as it fell face down before the ark of God, and tumors on the people breaking out, and in various places. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 12 records these tremendous circumstances that was going on. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, brought it into the temple of Dagon, and placed it next to his statue. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. But when they got up early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. This time, Dagon's head and both of his hands were broken off and lying on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso remained. That is why, still today, the priests of Dagon and everyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod do not step on Dagon's threshold. The Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod. He terrified the people of Ashdod and its territory and afflicted them with tumors. When the people of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of Israel's God must not stay here with us, because his hand is strongly against us and our God, Dagon." And so, as we keep going, we see that the ark of God gets moved to these various places, and we see that the Lord's hand's against that city, and then they send it on, and the same thing happens. And the fear of death pervaded the city as you come down to verse 11. God's hand was oppressing them. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. And so we see great devastation that takes place because they've got the ark of God. And this resulted in the people sending the ark back to the Israelites on a cart pulled by cows in chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 1. But then after a period of time, of about 20 years, Samuel urged the people to get rid of their foreign idols and set their hearts only on Jehovah. Chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. Time went by until 20 years had passed since the ark had been taken to Kiriath Jearim. Then the whole house of Israel longed for the Lord. Samuel told them, "If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths that are among you. Set your hearts on the Lord and worship only him. Then he will rescue you from the Philistines." So the Israelites removed the Baals and the Ashtoreths and only worshiped the Lord. And then God provided the victory for Israel over the Philistines, as you see in verses 9 through 14, as they raise up this stone of help named Ebenezer, and as God was striking them down, the Philistines thundering loudly against them, threw them into confusion, and they were defeated by Israel. Verse 10. And so we see that the Lord's hand was against the Philistines all of Samuel's life. Then verse 13. And we see Israel being victorious through this. But then, what we find happening as the story continues is that Israel demands a king. Samuel judged Israel throughout his life, 1 Samuel 7 and verse 15. When he grew old, we see that he appointed his sons as judges, though they were not righteous men, according to chapter 8 and the first 3 verses. We see that they didn't walk in his ways, and they turned toward dishonest profit, took bribes, and perverted justice. And then what we see happening is that all the elders of Israel gathered to Samuel and demanded that he appoint a king to lead and deliver them, just like all the other nations had, verses 4 and 5. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." And so they want to be like the other nations. And after this, we see that Samuel considered their demand wrong and prayed to the Lord. Verse 6. When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told Samuel that they had not rejected him, but had rejected God as their king, and to let them have their king, though warning them. We see in verses 7 through 9, the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." And so Samuel warned them, told them of what having a king would require of them in chapter 8, verses 10 through 18. And it's much the same as Moses had told them about and warned them about, if you remember back in Deuteronomy 17 in verses 14 through 20. Again, this demanding a king, but that may sound good to you. You may want to be like all the other nations, to have this king to look at to who's going to deliver them and so forth. But watch out, there's going to be things that come with that that you may not recognize. And they've been warned about that, but yet they're still demanding the king. And ultimately, what we see that God is telling them is, look, you're ultimately, in demanding a king, you're rejecting me as your king. You're rejecting me as your deliverer. Though, of course, they've been going after other gods for quite some time throughout their history. But even though they received this warning about what was to be, they still refused to be swayed and demanded a king. And so the Lord instructed Samuel to let them have what they asked for and appoint a king. Verses 19 through 22. The people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we must have a king over us, and then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles." Samuel listened to all the people's words and then repeated them to the Lord. "Listen to them," the Lord told Samuel. "Appoint a king for them." Then Samuel told the men of Israel, "Each of you go back to your city." And so a king they shall have, despite the warnings. So what we've seen is that Israel has repeatedly been rebellious against God. Now, even though God has continued to provide for them and deliver them, they have rejected God as their deliverer. Instead, they've opted to be like the rest of the nations. And we'll watch how this unfolds for them.